An abundance of confusion surrounds this entity that has been named SARS-CoV-2, and this is due to a number of dynamics. For one, there is an abundance of misinformation, and this misinformation has resulted in difficulties with diagnostic criteria, understanding the clinical picture, getting a sense of the differential diagnosis. What is the appropriate prevention? What are the appropriate interventions? And what exactly is the sequela of this thing known as SARS-CoV-2? And so you also have a situation where laypersons are also fueling this dynamic along with those who would be clinicians or those who would be theorists, those would be researchers. And so along with these problems with taxonomy, with nomenclature, you have laypersons communicating misinformation, indicating that SARS-CoV-2 is just a cold or a little flu. And these individuals have basically not a shred of data to support this contention. And so few individuals want to actually be bothered with the actual science that is actually available, because when looking at the actual science that is actually available, you see what looks like manifestations of if lupus and AIDS had a baby. And so what this looks like is not something that is a cold, even though there is this initial presentation of these cold and flu-like symptoms. What you see ultimately is an autoimmune process accompanied by immune exhaustion. As indicated, there is plenty of research that points in this direction. We're going to quickly look at this article from Autoimmunity Reviews. This is from 2020. And when you look at the totality of circumstances, it appears that the fuel for a lot of the confusion starts with the naming, simply giving it this name SARS-CoV-2, because that is not a large enough umbrella to cover everything that is going on with this particular situation. So here this article is SARS-CoV-2, the autoimmune virus. It indicates that increasing evidence has been accumulating from the past year on the outbreak of coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, suggesting a strong association between the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus infection and autoimmunity. And this has been evidenced by significant inflammation and autoimmune related symptoms by patients. And what these researchers found particularly noteworthy is that this particular microbe has the capability to trigger autoimmune disease in those individuals that are genetically predisposed. The researchers point to a number of overarching dynamics with respect to this SARS-CoV-2. One is this manifestation that individuals have of hyperstimulation of the immune system and this cytokine storm and this imbalance with respect to ferritin. And so they point out that initially individuals have symptoms such as fever, and then they have symptoms such as pro-inflammatory cytokines, that cytokine storm, the immune system basically going wild. And when this happens for some individuals, it leads to mortality. And so they've seen these cytokine storms in individuals who've been critically ill. And so some individuals may feel like they had a simple cold or they had flu-like symptoms. It may have been difficult, but they got over it. And so therefore they believe that all is well and they are out of the woods. However, because this thing has autoimmune capability, it's not necessarily the case that everything is over once the initial symptoms are resolved. And sometimes individuals may not have the full manifestations of autoimmune disease until years later. And so they may not even recognize that anything is going on with their body as these dynamics are progressing. And another thing that they indicate is that with this overproduction of cytokines, this enhances the inflammatory process. So there's an inflammatory process going on, but then you have this overproduction of these cytokines, and then this is triggering a high amount of ferritin in the blood. And so there are a number of dynamics going on with this SARS-CoV-2 that goes beyond this idea of a simple cold or a simple flu. But you also note, according to these researchers, that some of this cytokine storm dynamic and some of this heightened ferritin is sometimes noted when individuals have had influenza or other viral infections. And so along with this cytokine storm, what these researchers are also pointing out is that a number of autoantibodies are being reported in individuals with SARS-CoV-2. And one important autoantibody dynamic is anti-nuclear antibodies. And so they are finding this in these patients. And this is one of those baseline autoimmune markers. And so when they find this, then this is a red flag to perhaps look for some other autoantibodies with respect to diseases such as lupus and sarcoidosis. And so you also see a number of dynamics with respect to pneumonia in SARS-CoV-2 patients. So again, this is going above and beyond this idea of a simple cold. And here we see this very informative table that has been provided, and it is a list of autoimmune diseases and autoantibodies associated with COVID-19 infection. And so you see here on the left-hand side these autoimmune diseases and syndromes that are secondary to this SARS-CoV-2 infection, and they are many. And of course, the big one that you see towards the middle is lupus. You also see diabetes. You see things like sarcoidosis and psoriasis and Graves' disease and Kawasaki disease. And so you see quite a number of autoimmune diseases secondary to this SARS-CoV-2 infection. And so it is triggering a number of detrimental dynamics throughout the body that many individuals may not be aware of as they are experiencing these things. But when you have individuals pushing this narrative about it being a simple cold or a simple flu, the symptoms may not be accurately understood by those who are experiencing them. These researchers have also observed that the SARS-CoV-2 virus infection leads to yet another syndrome known as ASIA syndrome. And so this occurs when there is a SARS-CoV-2 virus infection. It could also simply be exposure. And then you have a genetically susceptible individual. And remember, we talked about that CCR5 dynamic wherein some individuals are just completely resistant, immune to certain microbes. Then you have this dynamic of the molecular mimicry, the hyperstimulation of the immune system, the cytokine storms, the fever, excess ferritin, autoantibody production, and then leading to autoimmune disease. And then in 2020, you had other researchers addressing the issue of the immune exhaustion. And so this article, this is 2020, is about the functional exhaustion of antiviral lymphocytes in COVID-19 patients. And so on one end of the spectrum, you have this heightened immune response and these cytokine storms. On the other end of the spectrum, according to these researchers, they find that there is functional exhaustion of lymphocytes associated with SARS-CoV-2 infection. And so what they are seeing is with SARS-CoV-2 infection, there is a breakdown, a potential breakdown of antiviral immunity at a very early stage. And so between these different groups of researchers, what you are seeing is concern about extremes at both ends of the spectrum. And they also point out that with this functional exhaustion at an early stage, this may result in significant disease progression. And so for some individuals, you might not see this exhaustion, and it appears to come down to genetic predisposition. And so for some individuals, there may not be a predisposition for this exhaustion, whereas for other individuals, that might be there. But of course, again, with these autoimmune dynamics, it's possible that an individual might not know that damage has been done or that things are progressing because they are feeling better in the moment. And as we wrap this up, finally, one thing that is being indicated by the researchers is that there is a need to prevent this functional exhaustion, and that if the functional exhaustion can be prevented, it's possible that the individual might be able to eliminate the virus from the body at an earlier stage of this SARS-CoV-2 infection. And finally, due to the significance of this particular situation and this concern, when individuals are bringing you opinion about this situation, you should always request, demand the science. And so you'll hear people say they are trusting the science, they are depending on the science. You need to be seeing the science. And so it's really disrespectful when individuals are talking about something as important as this and they are advancing a particular narrative, but then they cannot be bothered with actually presenting data. The same thing holds true for those individuals who are laypersons who are sharing these opinions. And so they share lots of opinions, and people sometimes just gobble up those opinions because that's what makes sense at first blush. However, those individuals also need to be required to provide the data. And so if there's no data, there's nothing for you to go on in order to determine if what is being said actually hangs together or actually makes any sense to you. And so you are due that, and you need to demand that, but you also need to do due diligence and research for yourself so that you understand for yourself to the best of your ability.